Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second book review. Today, we're going to talk about Portnoy's Complaint, a novel published in 1969, written by the award winning American author Philip Roth. The book was very controversial at the time when it was published, and it got banned from a number of countries for its candid and vulgar treatment of sexuality, which sort of brings it close to the book that we discussed in our last podcast, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray. The books are, however, very different in terms of style, especially, and not only, but I'm here with Fortunus Games, and she's going to cover a lot about the themes of this novel and the style and great many other things that we're going to discuss. So, Fortunus Games, let us start with the plot. Is there a plot in this novel?
I guess the plot is, Portnoy growing up, being hounded by his strict and demanding parents, and also him in his sexual life, especially as he grows up, and especially his most important relationship which is with his girlfriend, the monkey, as he calls her. And basically it's an exploration of what motivates this man. Why is he a sexual libertine? Why does he have the complexes he has about assimilation, about his parents, about sex, about marriage, about everything? Like, it's an exploration of his psyche.
Indeed, indeed. So the focus is not on the plot, but rather on the character, and it has a very interesting protagonist.
Definitely a very flawed person as well.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Why was the book so controversial?
I think it was controversial because it had very explicit depictions of sex, and also he was someone who was a sexual libertine. And a lot of the descriptions he has of women, even now, can be very shocking and considered misogynistic.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, as we're going to see in the quote section, indeed, there are things that would be very controversial even nowadays, albeit for different reasons than they were at the time. It was written in the 60s during the sexual revolution in the US. So that is certainly not a coincidence. Philip Roth is trying to say something about the attitudes, about the morality of his time, right? So, what was he trying to accomplish with this book, do you think?
I think it's an exploration of a certain type of person who grew up in the same years that Philip Roth grew up in. I think many of his protagonists, including Portnoy, are an expression of himself and his own experiences. Like Philip Roth, Portnoy was born in 1933, and he grew up in the 50s and the 60s. He went to university in the 50s. I'm talking about Roth. And then he graduated and started working in the 60s. So I think there was a huge difference between the 50s and the 60s. In some interviews that Roth had, he said that during the 50s, he was expected to be very behave in a very certain kind of way. During his university years, he didn't have any sex, as he said. People, like, there was a rumor that he was very sexually prolific, and he laughed and he's like, no, of course not. We weren't allowed to do that at university. It was a very conservative kind of atmosphere. Like, it was not really said that you couldn't do it, but you can feel that you shouldn't be doing those kind of things.
True, but Portnoy is more. I don't know if more sexual, but he more sexually accomplished, isn't he?
Yes, because he actually starts having sexual experiences in his teens.
So the novel is also addressing more than a character, more than a protagonist and a type of person, but also the attitude towards sexuality, the
Definitely.
hypocrisy maybe of society and of the people around him, because of course people in reality were doing at more things than they were talking about, or than the image that they were projecting.
Exactly. Yeah. And as we can see in another book that Philip Roth wrote much later in his life, in 2008, actually, this was written in 1969 for that reference, but it's also about a similar time period, but it's about a younger man in his late teens or early 20s, Marcus, and he goes to a university that's very strict. And it's a Christian university, so there's also, it's even stricter than the ones I think Roth went to, or I think Roth also went to a Christian university, at least for one of the universities he went to. So he knows how it's like. There were all these morals that you had to follow. You can't do certain things, and you have to be really polite. Like all of these kind of social ideas of what you should be doing in this point of your life, as a young person. So I think Portnoy is kind of a reaction against that kind of stifling atmosphere you see in the 50s. He's against the idea of being a good son or a good student because he's like, fuck you. He's the ultimate fuck you to the establishment.
He's very rebellious, and he's taking a conscious stand against his upbringing and against everybody, against what everybody else was telling him to do.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he's also against, in particular, his parents, who were very conservative, very hovering, maybe a little bit overindulgent as well. We always emphasize the point of how they are annoying or, a little bit too strict, but at the same time, they're very overindulgent. I think they spoil him in many ways.
This is really interesting. This combination of strictness and conservatism, and at the same time, the way that they make him self entitled.
And I think this is why Portnoy grows up to be so entitled and egotistic and maybe even misogynistic, because I think his misogyny is an expression of his egotism because he's an hedonist and he's attracted to women, right? So then he sees women as a way of satisfying his own urges because he's very, very self-centered. And why is he self-centered? I think his parents made him that way a little bit. I mean, he has to take responsibility as well. But when you look at how he was raised, even though they were strict, I think they also enabled him. They praised him constantly for being a genius, for example. And apparently he has like an IQ of 150 something. And he's like, there's no point of having such a great IQ because I'm still unhappy. Like he's like, bragging about his intelligence and his achievements, but they just feel empty at the end.
Yes. Well, his upbringing it indeed influenced his character, because this combination between strictness, criticism, and indulgence is like the recipe to make your child egotistic. Because on the one
Exactly.
hand, you will make him so proud of his qualities, but in some respects, he will be insecure, and he will try to prove something, constantly prove something, and go against every norm, even those norms that should be preserved, like being like not being mean to people, not hurting the people you are in a relationship with. But to some extent, when you want to be rebellious and you want to demonstrate something against the norms, then you may cross that line as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think he's also very arrogant about his intelligence, as we can see when he brags about his IQ. Because one of the problems he has with some of his girlfriends is that they're not well educated, especially the monkey, who is his main girlfriend and influences a large part of the book. She is someone who is barely literate, and her father was a coal miner in the South. She is from the South part of America, and he is from New York City. So that's also a difference. So then he kind of looks down on her for being uneducated. And as a result, he treats her very condescendingly at times. Like outside of them having sex, they don't really have great conversations or anything.
How does he explain the fact that they get together if he doesn't appreciate her at all beyond her physical qualities? How does he explain it?
Well, how they meet is kind of illustrating that. So I think she's a model at the time, if I remember correctly. And then she just talks to him. And then I think they instantly start talking about their sexual fantasies, and then they do it. I mean, one of the reasons why he's so attracted to her is because she is like the culmination of all of his teenage fantasies. Let me look for that that quote. It was very interesting.
Yeah, that would be a reason, indeed, especially because he was very sexual in his teenage years, or at least his fantasies were so active,
Mm.
and of course this triggers something in him meeting a woman like that with whom he has exactly this in common, the sexuality.
Yes, and one of the reasons why she's called the monkey is because she once did a weird sex act with a banana, like a really long time ago before she met him. And then she told him about this, and he's like, wow, this is so cool. And then this is why he calls her the monkey.
Okay.
Yeah. I found the quote now. So then he says, Doctor, I never had anybody like her in my life. She was the fulfillment of my most lascivious adolescent dreams. But marry her? Can she be serious? You see, for all of her preening and perfumes, she has a very low opinion of herself. And simultaneously, and here is the source of much of our trouble, a ridiculously high opinion of me, and simultaneously a very low opinion of me. She is one confused monkey, and I'm afraid not too very bright.
It's definitely condescending, but it is interesting how he describes her opinion of him.
Yes, so one of the reasons why he likes her is because she thinks he's a genius.
So she's there to satisfy his ego as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, because he's so educated, has a law degree, and he works for the mayor, and he fights for injustice, he fights against injustice, I should say. She's like, wow, you're so amazing. Like, because she grew up in a very small town where most people didn't go to university and were working class or even like working poor. So she's very surprised when she learns about Portnoy, and she thinks he's a really smart guy.
I see. So, and she's definitely not the kind of spouse that his parents would like to see him with, and well, not even himself, because he's not as detached from the norm to think he is, isn't he?
Yeah.
Because yeah, sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, you got cut with the. You go ahead.
Okay. I was thinking about what we were discussing in our previous sessions about the idealization of lower classes, for example, and we are going to discuss this with E.M. Forster's Morris and with the poems of Walt Whitman. And Portnoy is very far from that, even though he as well chooses partners and sexual partners from people with less education than himself. At the same time, he very much looks down on them.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah, it's very different from how Forrester, look, he didn't look down on them. He actually put them on the pedestal and said they were better because he never thought that education made someone better, right?
Exactly. Yes, definitely. Not education and not, high birth and family and all that. So they were all of them, all these three authors and their protagonists are in a way against the establishment, but in quite different ways, especially when it comes to sexuality and partners.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah. I think Portnoy is
So
the
in a way, Portnoy doesn't really break from
he's the
this
worst one. I
in
mean,
the end.
I think he's definitely the worst one. He has the most problems, and he's the most egotistic, right? I think he's worse than Clive in Morris, which will come out tomorrow. But as you will learn, Clive is also someone with a lot of issues.
Indeed, and with a lot of a high dose of conservatism, but yes, in very different ways. Um, So we've uncovered in this way the role of vulgarity in Philip Roth's novel, right? So, what does this vulgarity say about Portnoy as a character?
I would
The
say
fact
that,
that the novel was met with controversy because of the vulgarity.
right, yes. I would say that Portnoy is someone who uses vulgarity to attack the establishment and to express himself in a way, because a lot of his sexual longings or thoughts are expressed very vulgarly. I think, in contrast to Dorian Gray, which is heavily censored, even the uncensored version is heavily censored. And I would say in Morris, it's not quite, you know, like that. I mean, it is presented, but then it's not presented in a way that's kind of vulgar, right?
Yes, definitely. And also because, well, the protagonists are very different because Portnoy is really meant to be a flawed character, whereas, uh, well, the protagonist of Morris isn't. And so he talks about sex with people that he actually loves. So, of
Hmm.
course, the tone is different, the atmosphere is different. Portnoy is more comparable as a flawed character with Dorian Gray, but then the novels are so different because the styles of the authors were so different with Wilde's aestheticism and embellished narrative, and something that is meant to be very elegant and very erudite. Compared to Portnoy, who is written so many years later, and he is making a statement exactly from not being that.
Hmm. Here's an example of his extreme misogyny and extreme vulgarity. Warning, okay? I'm just placing a warning on this. If you don't want to hear this, skip this part. Are you ready?
I'm very eager to hear it.
Okay. Tits and cunts and legs and lips and mouths and tongues and assholes. How can I give up what I have never even had for a girl who, delicious and provocative as she may have been, will inevitably grow as familiar to me as a loaf of bread?
Yeah, this is some really nice objectification in a way.
Exactly. So he just sees, this is what a girl is. He never thinks about her feelings or what's in her head. It's just, the physical.
This is really interesting in a way because this enumeration of body parts, especially, well, genitalia or other parts associated with sexuality are also encountered in a poet like Whitman, but to a very, very different effect because Whitman associates sexuality and the bodily with spirituality and equates the body with the soul, whereas Roth's intention in Portnoy's words is well very much the opposite of that.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, there's many quotes that also show how Portnoy sees love. He's obsessed with sex, but he is very cynical about love. So he's describing himself and the monkey as they go on a trip, and he says, "Were we just two more rootless, jungle-dwelling erotomaniacs creaming in their pre-faded jeans over historical New England, dreaming the old agrarian dream in their rent-a-car convertible?" And another one about love. For love, what love? Is that what binds all these couples we know together? The ones who even bother to let themselves be bound? Isn't it something more like weakness? Isn't it rather convenience and apathy and guilt? Isn't it rather fear and exhaustion and inertia, gutlessness, plain and simple, far, far more than that quote love that the marriage counselors and the songwriters and the psychotherapists are forever dreaming about? Please, let us not bullshit one another about love and its duration.
That is a very cynical attitude indeed.
It is, yeah. Yeah, so this is how he sees sex versus love. Like he sees sex as a physical obsession that he can't rid himself out of. And he really wants to kind of use it as a way of escapism, I would say, because he doesn't really see a point in living. You know, he has a nice job. I guess he has some good friends and stuff like that, but then it doesn't really seem to fulfill him. Only sex does, because I guess he sees it as a way of satisfying himself. You know, he is an egomaniac, not just an erotomaniac.
That is very true. I mean, sex is a clear function for him, and like you said, that function is escapism because it brings him pleasure, but not enough to make him happy. So he's happy in that moment. So he has to do that over and over again, and with different people, because perhaps he's afraid of something, right? If you're running from something, you are afraid of something. So maybe this is what Portnoy is trying to mask with his attitudes and with his cynicism as well.
And there's another quote that talks about how he feels like he's behind everyone else because he's in his early 30s as he is narrating this biography of his life to his psychotherapist. And he feels like he's actually behind a lot of people, even though he feels like he's more accomplished in terms of his career. So he says, what use to skip those 2 grades in grammar school and get such a jump on everyone else when the result is to wind up so far behind?
In what way does he think he is behind?
I think it's because he's so unhappy and he feels like his parents and how they raised him still have an effect on how he is because he's 33 years old but he's still obsessed with sex like he's 23, and his and why he's obsessed with sex has to do with how his parents raised him, and he's still rebelling against that but he's 33 years old. I think that's what he's trying to get at.
Okay, his parents. This is a very interesting topic. Should we get to talk about his parents now?
Yeah, we're talking about his parents.
Great, because Portnoy's parents had such a great influence on him, and perhaps a lot of his fears and a lot of his obsessions and a lot of his cynicism in regard to marriage come exactly from the fact that his model relationship is the one between his parents, which is not really ideal, or at least they are not ideal people. And their whole idea of family, the one that he sees in his own home, is far from ideal, is it?
It is. And I'm going to share this short clip I found on YouTube from the movie adaptation of Portnoy's Complaint, which was made all the way, well, not all the way back. It was made in 1972. It was released in 1972. It was made in 1971. So made 2 years after, two years after the book was published. Okay, so here it is. Oh, let me see. Where is it? Here it is. I think you can hear the sound. Let me see if more share sound. Okay.
Okay, great.
You can see it, right? Yeah.
Yes, now.
So, how come you're in such a good mood lately?
Who's in a good mood?
You are. You haven't been Mr. Hot Under the Collar with me or your father for 5 weeks. I've been counting. I've been counting.
Must be the weather.
You want me to tell you what it is?
Actually, no, but you're going to anyway.
It's a girl. That's what it is. With long hair and long legs.
You've been going to that fortune teller again.
Save the smart remarks for Channel 13 and tell us about it.
Who?
The one Pearlie Ellenstein saw you with at Barnwood Tellers when she was shopping a panty girdle for her Ruthie.
She could use one herself.
The one you were kissing in broad daylight on 57th Street and 6th Avenue when Tessie Burlinger was getting on the number 5 bus and almost tripped on the steps.
Well, teach her to keep her eyes where they belong.
So?
So, congratulations. I hope you and the CIA are very happy together.
That's no answer.
Okay, okay. I wanted to save you the gushrying and the wailing, the moaning and the groaning. I'm going with a girl, a shiksa.
What's so new about that? When in your whole life did you ever go with a Jewish girl?
Once, when I was 12 years old, I walked a girl named Irene Faber to Hebrew school.
And it killed you, didn't it?
Jack, please. Your stomach. So you like this girl?
I like a lot of girls.
And she likes the Jews?
One. Me.
You think maybe she'd like your mother and father?
How do I know? Why shouldn't she?
You think maybe she'd like to meet us?
I'll ask her sometime, okay?
Yes, okay. This I want to see. They'll put it down in the history books. Ask her the next time you take her to some motel for the night.
It's not a motel. It's not for the night. It's an inn in Vermont. And it's for the weekend. This coming weekend.
Plum, darling, light of the world, think about what you're doing. Don't give yourself away, cheap. You must be careful of your life. Listen to what we're saying.
Who can help listening?
And without the scowl, thank you, and the brilliant back talk, we know, we have lived, we have seen it doesn't work, my Plum. They are another breed of human being. And Kyle, Jack, tell him, don't throw away a brilliant future on a blondie, please. She'll take you for all your work and leave you bleeding in the gutter. A brilliant baby boy like you. She'll eat you alive.
So yeah.
This was really fun. They are so pushy and nosy and loud.
Exactly. And some people were offended by this because it feels like a caricature. And, these kind of comedy routines were common in the 60s called Borscht Belt comedy. And a lot of the times it was about nagging parents or a nagging wife.
Oh, this is really interesting. I had no
Yeah, I found out when I was doing some research about, what inspired Portnoy's complaint. And it turns out that stand-up comedy was one of his influences.
Oh, I see. This is very interesting.
Yeah, so this is why some of his parents' dialogue is very over the top because it was inspired by stand-up comedy routines.
Oh, I see. I see. It is interesting that indeed they act as if he's the one who should be afraid of the girls because the girls that he's going out with are going to damage his reputation and break his heart and ruin his entire future, the one that he has worked so much on. So maybe they are also instilling some fear in him, and they have done it since childhood by pressing these attitudes upon him.
Oh, definitely. I think one of the reasons why Portnoy has so many issues is because his parents are so fearful. And as he says, I am marked like a roadmap from head to toe with my repressions. You can travel the length and breadth of my body over super highways of shame and inhibition and fear.
That is beautiful because he acknowledges that he does have a lot of inhibition and repression, but maybe not, I mean, definitely not in the same way as his parents, but the marks are definitely there.
Right. And he's influenced by Freud, right? Freud said, to be not repressed, usually when he talked about repression, he was always talking about sexual repression. So maybe Portnoy was inspired by that to be so sexually promiscuous, but at the same time, it's not solving his other inhibitions.
Definitely. Definitely he is still very fearful, and the things that his parents are talking about here are actually very much congruent with the fears that he actually has, because they are not really telling him that don't be promiscuous, in the same way that a girl's parents would tell their daughter. But in fact they are talking about a different kind of fear that Portnoy does seem to have, because he does not choose women that he can actually admire and that he can actually love. Maybe he's afraid to do this. He's afraid that investing more than sex in a relationship will actually lead to his destruction, like his parents say.
You're
So maybe
right.
he's exactly
Yeah.
choosing girls that he cannot love, right?
Mm-hmm. That's probably true.
The girls
Yeah.
that don't have the wit to manipulate him as well.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is why he wants to be intellectually superior. So he knows that the girls cannot play with him. If anything, he's the one who plays with them.
Exactly. Yes. And he's also afraid of boredom because he always thinks of sex or relationships as something that's really exciting and going against the grain. But then he says he's so afraid of being with someone who will become as familiar to him as a loaf of bread.
Yes, yes, he definitely doesn't have to doesn't want to have the life that his parents have, even though his parents have so much in common that I think that they are in a way having fun with each other because they understand each other so well. I really love the part where his father gets really excited and agitated, and his wife asks him to calm down, and then he says, think about your stomach, as if that was the main reason why he has to calm down. Not because he's exaggerating or he is like leave the boy alone. No, because it's your stomach. That was really
Yes. Yes. And oh yeah, here's another funny quote about how he sees sex. And he's saying this to the doctor. What I'm saying, doctor, is that I don't seem to stick my dick up these girls as much as I stick it up their backgrounds. As through fucking America, so as though through fucking I will discover America. So this also ties into what his parents were saying in the trailer, which was that they didn't really want him to be with someone who wasn't Jewish, and they think that he's looking down on his own ethnicity and his own religion, and that he's turning his back on them. Because there's another clip that's longer and where he's actually arguing with his parents about Judaism, and he says he's an atheist. He's not going to respect his parents in their own house when they're celebrating the high holidays. So he's like, that's your holiday, that's not my holiday. So I think that's another reason why he chooses women from a different ethnic and religious background than himself.
This is very interesting because in that commentary that he has about sex is also equally a commentary, a social commentary, and one about ethnic background and tradition and all of that. So that's actually a very complex quote. So, what are Portnoy's views on his ethnicity and religion, or his parents?
I think he's kind of torn. So basically, he knows that he should say he is proud, I think, but then at the same time, he feels some guilt or some kind of shame over it because during the time period he was growing up in, you know, people who were not Anglo-Saxon in America were still kind of considered second class, like not as bad as quote unquote people of color or, African Americans, especially during that time. Definitely not. But they were still not considered the same or as American as people who are of Anglo-Saxon background who have been in America for, over 200 or 300 years. So Portnoy, being a third generation immigrant of Eastern European and Russian Jews, he doesn't feel that American. At times people look at his name or, stuff that he does differently, how he was raised, how his parents didn't celebrate Christmas, and they don't see him as 100% American. So I think to compensate for this, he tries to be different from his parents. He wants to be more assimilated. He wants to not care about his cultural background and make himself 100% American. But then at the same time, because of how he was raised, because his parents were quite religious, he doesn't feel like he can completely break away from that. And he feels a sense of guilt for breaking away from it.
This brings so much depth to the character, the fact that he is so torn and that his attitudes are so conflicting, and in a way that not even he realizes, because he wants to break free from all of that, but at the same time the girlfriends that he chooses are really the kind of girlfriends that any American with education and money would choose, of someone that he can have an upper hand over.
Mm-hmm.
So someone lower status than himself, but at the same time American. So he makes those exact choices of the people that are part of the establishment. because that's
Exactly.
very much what a lot of men at the time were doing, right? Those who were being misogynistic. Why have a partner that I can look up to when I can have someone who looks up at me and who always says, "Oh, you're so fantastic. I would do anything for you."
Exactly. So this is why he only pretty much chooses women who are non-Jewish and they're like quote unquote 100% American who have been there for hundreds of years because he feels like if he attaches himself to these kind of women, then he won't have the identity issue anymore. Like he's like, "Oh, I'm with this girl. This means I'm totally accepted as American." And there's this funny part, I don't think I have the quote here, but I do remember reading it where he thinks about lying to this girl about his ethnic background. So like she finds out about his last name. She's like, "Oh, Portnoy, like what kind of last name is that?" And then he thinks about this elaborate lie to tell her that, "Oh, it's actually French, but it got corrupted," because that sounds more acceptable than telling her Portnoy is actually a Russian surname that means Taylor.
Oh, I see. So this is where his name comes from, and he this is what he's trying to hide when he makes up that story.
Exactly, because then he's like weirdly ashamed of his own ethnicity and background, and he's like, I don't want to explain it to a lot of people because he's afraid of discrimination, as well as the fact that he doesn't feel entirely comfortable with it because he always feels like he's not really part of society because of it.
So the qualities that he is very proud of and on the grounds of which he is so arrogant is well, mostly his intelligence or his personal quality, but every other quality or every other trait that puts him in a category is the one that he rejects.
Yes, I would say so because I think he wants to be an individual, but then anything that puts him in any ethnic or religious category, he just is a little bit scared of that because he feels like it limits him, I think.
Exactly. That's very true. I think it's an accurate description of his attitudes. And also I would say that perhaps his tragic flaw is the fact that in spite of his intelligence, he has some emotional immaturity if he cannot come to terms with these things. So bring himself to a balance.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is in a great part due to his upbringing.
Definitely. Yeah, here's another quote about what he thinks about his IQ. It's the one about his 158 points of IQ. It's funny. Think of it. Half the race is over, and I still stand here at the starting line. Me, the first one out of his swaddling clothes and into his tracksuits. 158 points of IQ, and still arguing with the authorities about the rules and regulations, disputing the course to be run, calling into question the legitimacy of the track commission. So
So
like
he's above even these things just because he has a high IQ.
yes, and at the same time he kind of recognizes that his IQ doesn't mean shit because he's saying that he's immature for always arguing with people about the smallest things, and it's because he has so many of these problems.
That's true.
Oh, and he also talks about his own views on vulgarity. If only I could have nourished myself upon the depths of his vulgarity, instead of that too becoming a source of shame. Shame and shame and shame and shame. Every place I turn, something else to be ashamed of.
This is very interesting.
So it seems like he sees vulgarity as a way of fighting shame and inhibition.
That is true. So he seeks to liberate himself from the expectations of his strict parents, and this is why he's so libertine, and why he uses these vulgar terms. He wants to be outrageous, and it is a form of rebellion, and not only rebellion, so towards the outside world, but also towards himself, because he's trying to escape his own shame.
Exactly. Yeah. They're like, I think it's really just, everything has to be viewed through his complexes. I think why Portnoy isn't happy is because he's so self-centered. He never views anything from anyone else's perspective, not even his own parents. It's always about him.
That's true. A real narcissist.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Which is
Yeah.
something very common when someone is brought up in the same way that Portnoy is brought up. So not that it is an excuse of his narcissism, but it is congruent.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, even the French name of this book, Portnoy et son complexe, tells us that, this what is central to this book is Portnoy and his various complexes, and I think the English name Portnoy's Complaint actually isn't as telling. We don't really know what he's complaining about, but it seems like after you read it, he's complaining about himself.
Oh, that's true. This is really interesting because the English name makes us think about a rant of someone who is not pleased with anything, but then the French one shows us that he is the subject of his complaint.
Exactly. Yeah. Another quote about how his parents treated him growing up. Quote, why doesn't she call the cops and get me shipped off to the children's prison if this is how incorrigible I really am? Alexander Portnoy, aged 5, you are hereby sentenced to hang by your neck until you are dead for refusing to say you are sorry to your mother. You'd think the child lapping up their milk and taking baths with his duck and his boats in their tub was the most wanted criminal in America.
So he was so criticized even when he was 5 that he's still so marked by his parents' criticism.
Yes. I think it's very interesting how his parents make so many excuses for him. Oh, baby boy, so genius, blah blah, but at the same time constantly criticize him. I can't get over that. It's comedic genius, but it also highlights just how many complexes it creates in him because it is very, kind of bipolar in a sense.
That's really interesting. Indeed, it is really fun, but if you think about it, it points to a uh, pretty dark reality because, of course, someone will develop a lot of complexes being subjected to this every single day. How
Exactly.
does he stand up to his parents? Because clearly he has accumulated so much resentment and he's complaining about them a great part of the book. So does he really stand up to them and in what way?
I don't think he really does. And this is one of the themes of the book and why he is so conflicted because he can't stand up to them. I think over time he just moves out and then he does his own thing. But when he visits them, like in the clip, I think they still have the same relationship where they just say all these things to him and he has to accept it.
Exactly. This is what I was thinking as well. So these kind of behavior was so much embedded in him and in his reactions that whenever he comes back to visit them, he falls into the same mold as before, the one that he had been trying so badly to escape.
Exactly. So it follows him throughout his life. And in the last part of the book, which is not discussed as much in analysis of this book, he visits Israel after breaking up with the monkey. And he meets another woman there, a Naomi, who is very different from the monkey. She is very well read, very intelligent and physically strong because, she served in the military as well, and he tries to seduce her but fails and he becomes impotent.
Oh, this is really interesting. I was really looking forward to see whether he tries to find a different kind of woman. And well, maybe his fears were well founded because now he finally tried to find someone that he can look up to, and he fails to impress her. So maybe
Oh yeah.
not as attractive as he hoped he was.
Yes, exactly. And this is very interesting because Naomi calls him out on a lot of things. Like she calls him weak, she calls him an idiot, egotistic. I need to find the quotes again. But then she actually, when he tries to sexually assault her, she knocks him down with a punch and then she steps over him and she's like, that didn't even work. Like that was just so
Oh,
pathetic.
wow.
Yeah. She was like, no one would actually like you here, you know? Like I don't know why in America you had so many girlfriends. She's like, you like no one would date you here.
Wow. This is really interesting. This sounds like a really powerful scene. This is like the comeback of all the women he's been with.
Exactly. Yeah. And then basically after that, he talks about becoming impotent. Like I don't think it's permanent or anything, but this incident has rendered him impotent for the rest of his trip in Israel. So he doesn't try to get laid or anything anymore. He just goes, he's like, I
Oh,
have to go back to America.
so the complexes are so amplified that he really loses the initiative to do anything else in that respect.
Exactly. Because she called him out on it. And basically, I think he kind of sees his flaws more carefully at the end.
So is this the highest point in his character arc? Does this trigger something in him, a change in his attitude?
We don't know because it ends, and I forgot what the last page of the book is, but it was basically a quote from the Old Testament, but it was like applied to the current situation. And basically, God talks to him for a very short amount of time, and he's like, "Yeah, now you're impotent. You deserve it."
Oh, I see. This is really interesting because this really is a nice character arc if we come to think about it. This is what it is about. So maybe that was the this is how his problems are solved by realizing the flaws in himself because he had been trying to seek answers and answers to the and solutions, sorry, to the faults in society and in other people, but maybe he has to change himself first, and this is the revelation that he has at the end.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And yeah, I'm just looking at the quotes again, and yeah, my internet's really slow right now. But from what I remember, he actually wanted to marry Naomi, but then she didn't even consider him as anything more than this random guy who was talking to her. So there is a very large difference in what they were expecting.
And her views of him are even worse than his views of his American girlfriends because he was fascinated by them sexually, at least. But then Naomi is not impressed with him, not sexually and not in any other way.
Exactly. Yeah, she's repulsed by him actually. So it's the and no one cares that he's like assisting the mayor in DC, like fighting injustice or anything. Like when he tells her about that, she's like, oh. It's not like his girlfriends, like the monkey, who are like, wow, you're amazing. Yeah. So it is funny. So like I guess at the end he gets his comeuppance. I mean, he finally gets a reality check and realizes he's not really that great.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. So, like we were talking in the beginning, that this is a kind of a book that would probably also be controversial today because of, well, his misogyny and his and other cynical things that he says. Then, of course, a book like this, where this is the conclusion, cannot seriously be accused of being misogynistic because it is recognized that this is one of his flaws and he's definitely meant to be a flawed character, so you can accuse Portnoy of being misogynistic but not the book. But unfortunately this is a confusion that people have done since forever when interpreting literature. So if there is a character that is somehow goes against the norms or does bad things or is not a role model, then people have the tendency to say, "Oh, this book is so immoral," you know.
Kind of like how Dorian Gray was presented as not a role model. But
Yes. Even though he was so harshly punished for everything that he did. So that is the central thing in the book, that he's punished more and more until the end when he actually dies. So that is really not a commercial to immoral lifestyle, you know. It's pretty much the opposite. It says don't be as inconsiderate as Dorian. Okay, it's not his promiscuity that is criticized indeed, but it is his callous treatment of people and his murders, right, that he eventually
yeah.
does. So, but definitely he is punished. And so is Portnoy, even though in a very different way, but he doesn't get away with it.
No, especially since, he was so obsessed with his dick the entire book. And at the end, he just becomes impotent.
Well, this can actually help him, right? Because it is a revelation, it is a solution to his problems. Maybe by lowering his standards, he can be happier because he was having unrealistic expectations and he was not delivering either. So it's not like he was perfect in his relationships with other people. So why would he expect perfection? But maybe from now on, what awaits Portnoy is more realistic expectations and hence more happiness.
Who's worse as a person, Dorian Gray or Portnoy?
Oh, this is a good question. It's interesting how that there are similarities even in books apparently as different as these two. Well, I would say that um, well, Dorian has to be worse because he even commits murder and people commit suicide. Two people commit suicide because of him, and then he kills his, well, the only person who actually loved him, Basil Hallward. So it's, I would say that really tops anything that Portnoy can do. But beyond that, I don't know. Dorian doesn't treat or is definitely isn't as cynical. He isn't really cynical.
Hmm. That's true. I think we're not talking about personality. Well, I guess personality also counts because I mean, you have to have certain personality traits to kill someone, right? So I would say Dorian is definitely worse all around.
Yes. Yes, yes, but at the same time, I'm not. I think he's better company than Portnoy.
But he
Is
might be
that?
more dangerous, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. And also, he doesn't whine as much.
Oh, this is why it's called Portnoy's complaint.
Yes, true.
Because he thinks that without complaining, how can you get to the bottom of what all his complexes are about?
Yes, yes, that's true. The cynicism makes him have very much in common with Lord Henry because some of the commentaries that they make on women, on society, on the hypocrisy of people, on morality are very similar to what Lord Henry was saying, who was the real cynic in the picture of Dorian Gray.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think we said also that Lord Henry is a lot like Ardayan.
Oh yes, yes, which brings us to the part that I was really looking forward to. Well, we everyone saw similarities with some of your characters. So, okay, let's start with this. Portnoy as a cynic and Ardayan. How do you think that they are similar?
I think that both of them are very cynical, and in a way, they're both, very obsessed with sex, but in different ways.
In what ways? How do their views on sex contrast?
I would say that Portnoy is doing it because of his complexes, and I think Ardayan maybe a little bit, but he's motivated mostly by hedonism. Well, I think Portnoy is motivated by hedonism, but then his hedonism is a direct result of his complexes growing up.
That's true. That's true. And that really reflects in their behaviors and their attitudes because Ardayan is so much more laid back than Portnoy is.
Yes, and there's a quote where Portnoy talks about how he's a very repressed person, and I guess this is why he feels very different from um Ardayan, right? Because Ardayan, I don't think he has that much anxiety. Well, I think Portnoy has a lot.
Oh, definitely. Definitely, and there is not much repression in Ardayan. Well, at least not when he is the age that he is in Salmon, New York.
True, yeah. He definitely doesn't have that many problems, I think. And I think Ardayan is a little bit more fatalistic than Portnoy. I mean, both of them are. But then I would say that Ardayan is more comfortable with death or like losing or suffering because he accepts everything that life throws at him, right? He's like, this is what happens. You can't run away from it sometimes. But Portnoy is very afraid. So that itself tells us that he's afraid of death, afraid of losing.
That's true. And Ardayan has gone through a lot of things and accomplished a lot of things on his own. So maybe this made him tougher as well, his experiences.
Definitely. Yeah. So another thing that would be different is that I think Ardayan isn't as vocal or verbal as Portnoy. He even if he does have complexes, he doesn't tell anyone about them.
He doesn't complain.
No, I don't think he does. Yeah.
Yeah, he's more cynical in the way that Lord Henry is, who really doesn't say anything about himself. So Ardayan and him are quite similar in this respect.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I would say that another difference they have is that Ardayan isn't really that driven by sex compared to Portnoy. I think Portnoy, like he says in one of these quotes, he can't control himself sometimes. But Ardayan, he's doing it mostly because he's bored, not because he can't control himself.
I see. Yeah, that's an important difference. What about misogyny?
Hmm. I think maybe Portnoy's more misogynistic in a way, especially how he describes people, because I think he's more egotistic than Ardayan is. What do you think?
Oh yeah, much more, but I think in different ways because Ardayan is more manipulative. I don't think Portnoy has this aspect.
That's true. I think he's too self focused to be manipulative.
Exactly, yes, yes. So he's more into seeking his own satisfaction and not really to accomplish something.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is why he, I mean, he is well accomplished in his career, but he never really thinks for himself in a sense. Like he's just like, yeah, I'm making all this money. I have a job. Yeah, that's it. I'll just do all the sex stuff because that's what really interests him. But there's nothing really constructive either. Like nothing comes of his relationships. They never get married. There's no great conversations. It's just sex.
That's true, and nothing comes out of his relationship with his parents as well because it doesn't really change for all his rebelliousness. He cannot really effectively stand up to his parents and really make a difference. Whereas I don't imagine Ardayan having such problems with pretty much anyone, so really not finding an effective way to stand up. He's
Hmm.
really different in this respect.
And I read this interesting essay where they talked about how Portnoy's sex life is actually, it's basically in contradiction to what he wants, right? Yes, he's trying to be free and whatever and try to be independent from his parents and go against the culture. But then at the same time, he is just controlled by his libido and there's no point to it. Like basically, when he was young, he was obsessed with masturbation, right? But then as he grows older, he's still masturbating only into someone else. He's not like when he has sex with someone, is he actually even acknowledging the other person or is he just masturbating into their bodies?
That's true. So it's basically a more acceptable way to masturbate, because if he continued to masturbate in his adulthood, he would think, I'm such a loser. But now this is a way in which he can do this. He keeps doing that, but he doesn't think he's a loser anymore, because he can say, oh, look at how many women I've had. I'm not a loser. It says here in the number.
Exactly. But yeah, the problem is that there's nothing that ever comes out of it. You know, all of his girlfriends break up with him because they can't stand him any longer. And he never gets anything out of it other than sex. I mean, he doesn't get any emotional bonds or great conversations or have a life together with these people. It all just evaporates.
Indeed, he doesn't even escape boredom, except for the moments when he has sex. When, well, we have to be truthful. That doesn't last that long. I mean, it's not like it occupies days and days. He would win so much more if he could actually have someone to talk to and to bond with emotionally and to feel understood. So sex is not really the best solution to all of his disappointment in the world.
He should just marry the psychoanalyst. Because that's the only person who is
Yeah.
listening to him. No one else listens to him, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, she's not a woman.
It's a man. It's an old man.
Oh, oh, yeah, I see. Maybe if he was a woman, then Portnoy would have a better opinion of women and higher standards, you know?
That's true. But if it was a woman, maybe he couldn't say so many things without being accused of sexual like assaults, because he says a lot of these things that could come off as sexual assaults.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. That actually really reminds me of The Sopranos, because it is in a way it is the same thing with the therapist and him complaining about everything and really not being able to change and to escape his background. I mean, the protagonist Tony Soprano, and not being able to escape his background of his ethnicity and the world of crime that he lives in. And it's exactly and he also has similar problem with the women he associates, and he complains about them, and he ends up falling in love with the therapist because she's the only one really in the world who can understand him. And of course that doesn't work out because she knows better than to be with someone like that. So again, the problem that when someone is really much more emotionally mature, they cannot live with a person like this.
Absolutely. I think this is also why Portnoy's partners are also immature, because he's immature. So the only women who like him are emotionally immature ones who don't really understand why he's flawed at first.
That's true. That's true. Oh yeah, this is another comparison that's interesting with Portnoy's Complete and The Sopranos.
That I don't think anyone has made that comparison before. We're making all kinds of interesting comparisons.
Yeah, I know, I know, and that's actually really legit, even in the theme of ethnicity and what it means to be an American, and I think I don't know, third, fourth generation immigrants. Just they are Italian, of course, so it
Mhm.
does have a lot of things in common.
I think he's also from New York City, right?
New Jersey. Yeah.
Oh, you know what? Portnoy's actually from New Jersey. He works in New York City later on in his life, but when he grew
Oh.
up, he came from Newark, New Jersey, which is where Roth grew up as well.
Oh yeah, that's exactly like that. We have to check if someone else made this comparison as well.
It's interesting. I think it's because New Jersey also had a lot of Jewish people and Italians. Because
Mm.
I remember reading this biography of Philip Roth, and he said where he grew up in Newark, which is mostly African American now, but in the past it was mostly Irish, Italian, and Jewish. So kind of like New York City, but like on a smaller scale.
Oh yeah. Yeah, this is interesting. We're discovering so many things.
Yes, definitely. And yes,
Oh,
we need to compare Sam and
yeah,
Portnoy.
that this is what I was about to ask. So what about Sam? We definitely see a resemblance in their family situation. And Lev and Raisa have a way of pushing Sam's limits in a way, and of forming his views on his attitudes, his rebelliousness. But how would you compare this?
I think that Sam's personality is really different from Portnoy's, first of all.
Mm, very much, yes.
I wouldn't say that Sam is very cynical. Do you think he is?
No, I don't think so. I don't really think so. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
of course, he has doubts um and worries, but I wouldn't call him cynical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think he's also not as misogynistic as Portnoy,
No,
obviously.
yeah, not at all. No.
And even though he goes to Ardayan's bookstore, I don't think he is anywhere as sexually driven as Portnoy is.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Frankie would be a more appropriate comparison in this respect, wouldn't he?
I think so, but even then, I don't think he's like Portnoy. Like, I mean, he doesn't really complain about himself or, really think about things in such a fatalistic and cynical manner. I think the cynicism out of all my characters is most like Ardayan.
Oh yeah, definitely. And also Frankie's nowhere near as cold when it comes to relationships, because he can really fall in love, even if sometimes it is for a short while, but he does fall in love, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think that's another difference. I mean, Frankie is the kind of person who likes to spoil the person he's in love with. So he's not emotionally detached like Portnoy is. I mean, Portnoy, he makes it all about sex because it's his own problem, really. Because I mean, he's the one who only focuses on that aspect. I mean, if he didn't do that, it wouldn't be as bad.
Yes. Yes, and that is quite true. And
Yeah.
so, back to Sam's parents. How do Lev and Raisa compare to Portnoy's parents?
I think there are some similarities, but the difference is that they're not as loud. And I don't think they're not as forceful in a sense, especially when he's like a child. I mean, as we see in Sam New York, they aren't like that when he's 5 years old. They don't really constantly criticize him until he's older. And so it changes over time, unlike Portnoy's relationship with his parents, which doesn't change, right? So this is why he feels like he's being infantilized, because from age 5 to like 33, it's still the same in many ways. But I think for Lev and Riza, they were pretty okay and lax when Sam was young, ironically, and only became stricter when he went into high school because they were scared that, especially with their business not doing that well, that they're not going to make it. So they're like, he has to be a lawyer in order to succeed. So that's where they got the idea from. So it's more influenced by external factors, this fear of not being able to succeed and that Sam will become really, really poor if he doesn't become a professional. So it's more about that rather than just criticizing him for whatever reason.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it is directly tied with his with the success of his career and with their fears that he would not be able to be an accomplished person. Do you think that if Sam was so accomplished in his career as Portnoy is, they would really stop criticizing him altogether? I mean, not even about his relationships and everything else.
Yeah, I think 90% of the criticism would just go away. I think it really is just about economic stability. Like his relationship, I don't think they criticize it as much as Portnoy's parents. Because another thing that they have in, like, not in common, totally different, is that Portnoy's parents are very conservative and they're also religious. So, like, they go to synagogue and stuff like that. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you have Levin Reiser who are atheists. Portnoy was atheist, but his parents are not. But then Levin Reiser are atheist, and they raised Sam to be like no religion. They wanted him to make his own decision about religion. So yeah, they do have their Yiddish identity and all of that, especially since the language was still spoken. While in Portnoy's case, it was no longer spoken. So I guess this is another reason why they emphasize religion so much, because they've already lost part of their heritage, which Portnoy says, I only know like a few dozen words in Yiddish and they're all mispronounced and they're all swear words. So he doesn't actually know anything about the language. Well, Sam, he knows the language very well. He goes to Yiddish theater, constantly talks to people, not just his parents, in Yiddish. So it's a different culture, different time, and different attitudes towards their own culture, right? Because Sam has a more tangible connection with his Yiddishkeit or Yiddishness, while I think Portnoy doesn't really. And why his parents are so afraid of him losing his culture is because they don't have the language anymore. They don't have Yiddish theater or anything else. So this is why they want him to be religious, but then he's an atheist. So they felt like he's losing it all. And I think this is why they emphasize on him trying to stay within the community, but then he doesn't do that either.
That's true. So, yeah, and Sam's parents are very different kinds of people because they were also rebellious when they were young, when they were Sam's age. So this is different from Portnoy's parents were always very conservative. So
Mm-hmm.
also in terms of relationships, Sam's parents don't really care about what kind of women he is dating, or they wouldn't criticize him as much. So even if he had a very good job, they wouldn't say, oh, why are you with this girl who is, I don't know, of a, who doesn't have as much money or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. I think there are some fears which they raise with him, like if the girl's from a very different social class, as we learn about with Lena and Sam, right? Because I think we can see a parallel with how Portnoy's mother was talking to him. Like they are afraid that she's just playing with him and he's too naive to know. And, yeah, she's just basically just playing with him and doesn't respect his feelings. And she just wants to get like fun or something out of this. And I think this is a fear that they do have. But for other love interests like Katya, for example, I don't think they have that much criticism because she's from a very similar social strata as they are. Well, she is worse off, but then they're both from the Lower East Side and they're both working class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct.
Hmm. And for the LGBT love interests, I think that's another issue.
Oh yeah, no, that's completely different. And this theme doesn't appear in Portnoy's complaint either, so it's too different to compare.
Well, I think if Frankie was a woman or if Sam was a woman and Frankie was a man, it would be great. I mean, best friends and now they are getting married. I mean, who wouldn't like that? But the fact that they are a gay couple, I think his parents would find it strange because they grew up with the idea that Sam was straight. Because, Sam, I would say 90% of him is heterosexual, right? And 10%'s not. And he grew up having not relationship, but crushes on girls and stuff. So they don't think he is gay, unlike some other people's sons who might have just shown signs that they were homosexual since a very young age.
Yeah, so that would come as a huge shock to them. If Sam came like, okay, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I'm very much in love and I'm going to marry my best friend and we're getting along so well. The bad news, it's Frankie.
Yeah. They would think it's a phase, or like Frankie is some kind of pervert who is like putting in some weird ideas in his head. Because I don't think Sam's parents understand like bisexuality really. Like they know some people are 100% gay, so whatever. But then when you start out or you give off the impression that you are straight or primarily straight, and then suddenly you're with someone of the same sex, people start thinking that you're a quote unquote being influenced by the media or being influenced by bad friends, or going through a phase. This is what a lot of people who are bi or pansexual go through, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely even today, not to mention the times that Sam in New York takes place. So there is, of course, little wonder that this would be happening in Sam's case, unfortunately.
Yes, like unfortunately, a lot of people are still scared to come out as bi or pansexual because, parents or society always seem to assume that it's a phase, or like, oh, you're just doing this for attention or whatever.
Yeah, that's true. And this is today when there is a lot of talk, especially in, well, in some countries, not all of them, but talk about gender identity and sexuality and things like that. But then in Sam's time, there was nothing of the sort. So, of course, they had very wrong ideas about what that means and
Exactly.
no guideline as to how to interpret it in their son.
Yes. And another thing that was influenced by Portnoy's complaint in my works is the stream of consciousness.
Okay, I see. Indeed, indeed. So, what about the stream of consciousness? The technique itself only, or also the tone, parts of the those comedic thoughts? How would you describe the similarity?
I think it's a very good way of working out each character's voice, especially if you're doing this like in the anthology that I'm releasing. Like not just Sam, but like all of the characters. Like if I feel like it, I can just write a story from their voice, and that explores a lot of aspects that we might not get to see until much later on in the comic itself. When you're narrating in someone's voice, it reveals a lot of things that you might not have necessarily thought about in the past.
Definitely, and it is also very interesting to explore the inner voices of different characters, not like in Portnoy, just the main character, but in your anthology of short stories, especially the voices and the thoughts of a lot of the other characters as well.
Exactly. And it helps me to brainstorm, especially about the more undeveloped characters. Because sometimes it just is really hard for certain characters. Like, you don't really know anything about them until suddenly you're like, oh, you know what? I feel like writing about them. And suddenly you get all these ideas that you never had for the whole year. Like, for example, I was just looking back at some stuff from 2019. And back then, I just realized I had no idea what I was doing except for Sam. Like all the other characters were so underdeveloped back then. And this is why I didn't draw any art of anyone besides Sam for the most part. Because when I don't know anything about a character, I feel less inclined to draw them.
That's very accurate. And the immersion is lacking. You have as a writer to learn how to think like that character in order to be able to write them accurately.
Exactly. Yeah. And draw them accurately too. Or otherwise, it just feels uninspired.
Yeah, that's true. Otherwise, it's just a portrait, an exercise in their features, facial features. But even then, you have to know more about their personality because it's not the features themselves, but the expression and what they suggest to the viewer.
Exactly. Or like the whole tone or feeling of the picture. Like if you just draw someone, it's just like drawing a portrait of whatever, right? It just feels like a random art breeder picture.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Are there any other quotes that you would like to share with us, or any other influences that you can think about in your own work?
Mm, let me see. Oh yeah, here's another one about what he thinks about sex. What, after all, does it consist of? You put your dick someplace and move it back and forth, and stuff comes out the front. And another one where he's really arrogant again. Really? Can they be this blind? Can people be so abysmally stupid and live? Oh yeah, here it is. He talks about being American and jerking off. This is
Okay,
crazy.
the
Oh my,
same fragment. This will be interesting.
oh my America of the plains and the mountains and the valleys and the rivers and the canyons. It is with just such patriotic incantations as these that I have begun to put myself to sleep at night after jerking off into my sock.
It's a high sock. Oh gosh, this is so funny.
Another one where he talks about his parents and all the grievances he has, and it's very dramatic. He says, "Phew, Have I got grievances? Do I harbor hatreds that I didn't even know were there? Is it the process, doctor? Or is it what we call the material? All I do is complain. The repugnance seems bottomless, and I'm beginning to wonder if maybe enough isn't enough. I hear myself indulging in the kind of ritualized belly aching that is just what gives psychoanalytic patients such a bad name with the general public. Could I really have detested this childhood and resented these poor parents of mine to the same degree then as I seem to now, looking backward upon what I was from the vantage point of what I am and am not? Is this the truth I'm delivering up, or is it just plain kvetching? Or is kvetching for people like me a form of truth? Kvetching is the Yiddish term for complaining.
Okay, yeah.
Is complaining a form of truth for Portnoy? I guess it is, because without complaining, he wouldn't be at the psychoanalyst, right?
Yeah, definitely. This is a great step for him because he went there to talk about himself, which is something that he obviously very much enjoys, and to complain, but also to find out some truths about himself.
And they're all pretty bad truths.
Yeah, that's true.
So yes, is there anything else that you've noticed, from Portnoy's complaint that influenced my work?
Hmm. Other than this, well, I scenes of masturbation.
Hey, that's for Patreons only. We will not be on Tapas.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, this is a nice incentive to join Patreon because thinking about one's life and grievances about society at the same time as doing this, this is really this is a really interesting combination. And also, we are going to see something of the sort. I mean, not thinking about one's life, but similar to the quote in Portnoy, America and masturbation, we are going to encounter exactly this when we are going to discuss Walt Whitman's poetry. He was also fond of both America and masturbation.
Yes, yeah. It is funny how when he was thinking about America's canyons and mountains and he suddenly jacks off. Because Walt Whitman also describes a lot of what America looks like, the nature and stuff. And then he suddenly puts in a sexual scene.
Oh yes, exactly. Exactly. I wonder if Philip Roth was inspired in these scenes by Whitman because it's so iconic the way in which Whitman describes both of these aspects that I think that he cannot not think about it.
I think so. I think he was inspired by him because uh, he is trying to write the great American novel in a lot of sense. So he has to refer to all of these great American authors.
That's true, and Whitman is, after all, the national poet. So how can you not think about Whitman when describing this? Even though they would have so many differences, especially in terms of how they view sexuality, because
Oh.
Whitman was so much of a hippie in this respect, whereas Portnoy really is not.
Ironically, though, some people would see him as a hippie because he's promiscuous.
Oh yeah, yeah. Maybe from the outside, so someone who see him as, oh look, I've been with so many women, I'm having so much fun. Maybe they would think he is.
Because a true hippie is relaxed, right? They don't have that many like problems as he does.
Yeah, in relation to society, yes, but in relation to sex, they're so laid back. So yeah, Whitman was the same, but then Portnoy, yeah, very different as we have seen.
Yes. So,
Well, this has been a
yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, this has been a really interesting conversation and really fun. And I love to learn more things about this novel and how it ties in with the subject that we have already discussed and that we are going to discuss, and with your own work as well.
Yes, definitely. Next week, we're going to be talking about Walt Whitman and his poetry and how his views on love and sex have influenced your character, Eyolf.
Yes, I cannot wait to do this. And tomorrow we have Ian Forster's Morris, and soon another novel by Philip Roth. So stay tuned, everyone, for other book reviews.
Yes, we have so much to cover.
Indeed. All right. Thank you so much, Fortunus Games. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.